Well, hello everyone. Today we are taking our next step in our journey of prayer. In the last video, we spoke about how prayer is meant to be a conversation, which means that God actually wants to speak with you. That we are meant to receive God's love and His grace within the context of prayer. Because prayer is a friendship. Prayer is a communion with God. But here's the thing, and here's the next step. That friendship with God is meant to be a lived reality, which means it's meant to be active and dynamic, and it's meant to cover the whole of our life. So the goal of prayer is not just to spend all day in the church. The goal of prayer is not to pray all day, although we do need that dedicated time of prayer. That's why I challenged all of you to take at least 10 minutes a day of silent prayer. But the goal of prayer is that lived friendship. So prayer is always going to lead me to action. And then that action is always going to lead me back to prayer. So that's that beautiful dynamic of friendship. Prayer and action, action and prayer. You might remember in the Gospels, Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he gives a famous answer. Here's what Jesus says. He said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments. So there it is. In prayer, like Jesus says, we're made capable of loving God more and more with our whole being, and to receive God's love back into our hearts, which expands our hearts so we can receive love even more and love God even more. But then it should lead us to what Jesus calls the second commandment, which is to love our neighbor as ourselves. So prayer should always be leading me to a greater love of neighbor, a greater love of those people in my life. St. John, in his first letter, puts it really well. This is what St. John says. If anyone says, I love God, but hates his brother, he is a liar. For whoever does not love a brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. So if we claim that we love God, but then are not loving the people in our life, St. John says we are liars. Maybe you've known somebody in your life who seems to pray a lot, but they're kind of a jerk. And there's a disconnect there, isn't there? Like, wow, you pray a lot, but you're not a very nice person. And I think, not to be judgmental, but St. John would say, are you really loving God if you're not loving your brother or sister around you? So prayer is always going to require this response. Prayer is always going to lead us to love people more. I think that loving other people is always a good measurement on how our prayer is doing. It's kind of like a barometer. So if I'm looking at the people in my life and I'm kind of being a jerk to them, I'm not very kind or patient or gentle, then that's probably a sign that there's something off in my prayer too. Am I really relating honestly with the Lord? And on the other hand, if I find that I am being generous and selfless and I'm sacrificing for my brothers and sisters and I'm loving my neighbor as myself, then that's probably a good indication that my prayer is authentic and I am relating to the Lord and receiving well. This is where I think the practice of regular confession is so, so helpful for our life of prayer. Because in confession, we can take a moment to examine our conscience and to really look at those two commandments. Am I loving God with my whole being? And am I loving my neighbor as myself? And if, as I examine my conscience for confession, I recognize that I have not been doing that, I can repent, I can be forgiven, I can start over, and then I can re-enter into my prayer and into my action with renewed vigor because of that grace of the sacrament. This is also where the practice, which is very ancient in the church, called spiritual direction, could be helpful. Spiritual direction usually involves two people, the director and the directee. In the context of spiritual direction, you're able to go to another person who maybe has experience in prayer, and you're able just to share, like, here's what's going on in my life of prayer. Here's what's going on in my love of other people. And a spiritual director can kind of help see how the Spirit is moving in your life and maybe how he is calling you to a greater love of God and greater love of neighbor. And so it's recommended for Catholics who want to grow in prayer that they would seek out a wise director, if possible, in order to help them in this growth. So confession and spiritual direction are two helpful tools that we have as Catholics in order to live in this response to God in our prayer. So to sum up, prayer is never going to leave us just thinking about ourselves, but it's always going to move us, propel us out in order to love others as well. Prayer enables us to be better lovers of our neighbors, better lovers of our brothers and sisters, better lovers of people close and far. And if prayer is not doing that, then that means that there's something off. So as we continue our series on prayer, we're going to kind of look a little bit more closely on how we put all these pieces together so that our life of prayer can be one of that dynamic friendship with God.